Thank you all for coming today. My name is Sean Kolb. I'm a relationship manager with Northwest Farm Credit Services. We are so proud to sponsor the Oregon Wine Symposium again, continuing our long-term ongoing commitment to the Oregon wine industry. Congratulations to the Oregon Wineries Association, the Oregon Wine Board, and the organizing team for putting together another incredible symposium for us. Northwest Farm Credit Services is part of a $320 billion national farm credit system. We are turning 100 years old, actually last year. We are the #1 lender to U.S. agriculture. If you haven't had a chance to stop by our booth, we're in the center of the trade show floor. We have a couple of really fun tools that I think are fun that we worked hard to prepare for you. Love to share those with you, say hello, connect with you. We have a price to earnings study that we prepared, and also a land valuation analysis that breaks down all of these things by each AVA. So please stop by, say hello, introduce yourself, and we'd love to walk you through that. Channel management is very important. We understand that from a financial perspective. Looking forward to hearing from the panel today on their view and hearing some encouraging words on how to improve that area of your business. Thank you for your time. We look forward to this session today. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming on the snow day. I can kind of see people out there. The lights are a little bit tough. So if you have questions or comments, a lot of you could be on this panel, so you need to volunteer for next year. So if you have questions as we're getting going on our discussion, or if you have a good idea or a good tip, please put it on the app and we'll bring it up. So I wanted to say thank you to Annie, Gaironn, and Alison for joining me this morning on the panel about channel management. And we don't have a big, extensive PowerPoint presentation, so we thought we'd just have a good discussion. We have several topics that we want to convey and bring up some examples to you, so we'll get started. So I thought one way, a lot of us have been in the wine business for several years, so the question I was posing to the group to get started with is, what is the thing that has changed the most in the last 10 years within channel management? And I think some of these ideas that'll come up will help us get going on what some of the topics are we should be talking about when we're talking, and how do we define channel management and what that means to each of us in our business. So we're all doing very similar things in very different ways. So it'll be fun. So the thing that has changed the most in the last 10 years. I know Annie was up thinking about this all night.
And I can't come up with just one.
Okay, that's fair.
There's two. I'll keep it to two. But hi, I'm Annie Schull, Raptor Ridge Winery. Nice to see you this morning. So two things that really changed from 2008 to 2018. We did not have bricks and mortar, did not have a tasting room in 2008. And we were in 8 states for distribution. So I would say those are the two major changes. 2010, we built our first tasting room and winery, and we're now in 31 states in 2018. So I think the emphasis on, for sure, consumer direct became much more important to the industry, and diversification and spreading out across the United States.
Nice. Gaironn Poole from Poole & Sons Consulting. So I as well had a two-part answer. The first one on a more personal level, 10 years ago, I was actually a buyer for a group of restaurants based in Portland. And I know we take it for granted now, but I would say technology. Placing my orders via email was very edgy at the time for a lot of my sales reps. I had 2 sales reps that didn't even have email addresses at the time. And now we just how is that even possible? I can't imagine how we would do our job or do FOB sales without computers. So that would be the #1 thing I've seen that's changed is lovely technology. And on the more grandiose scale, I would say the Oregon product is now known. The level of ambassadorship we have to be on the road now can be a little more refined rather than just letting folks know we make wine. A lot of that path has been beaten down from the work of the previous generation. So that's been a nice luxury to start dabbling in a deeper level of what we are here for.
So
The landscape and distribution has changed dramatically in the last 10 years, and I think that's been most noticeable for us in terms of the consolidation of distributors, and then also the consolidation at retail. And specifically at retail, I think Fred Meyer is a great example where, back in the 80s and the 90s, Fred Meyer was such an important part of the growth of the Oregon wine industry, and their support of the Oregon wine industry really helped push sales ahead for all Oregon wineries here locally. And now, as they're part of Kroger, the buying is transitioning to Cincinnati, and so that hurts. That's really painful, and it's not just Fred Meyer, but that's happening with a lot of retailers where it used to be wine stores could make independent decisions at their stores, and now everything's getting centralized. So that's been a really big change on the distribution on the retail side. On the D2C side, things haven't changed that much for us, although I would say that the quality of the visitor to Oregon has evolved quite a bit, and we're getting much more sophisticated and intentional buyers who are coming to Oregon, which means that we have to elevate our hospitality experience as well to be able to, these are folks who go to Napa regularly, they go to Sonoma, they go to Rioja, they're true wine connoisseurs and lovers, and now they're coming to Oregon, which is amazing, and we need to evolve our hospitality experience to their levels. The other thing on the DTC side for us that's evolved over the last 10 years is phone sales. And I remember when we first started talking about this, 6, 7, 8 years ago, I'm like, phone sales, are you kidding? I hate telesales. I hate when people call me. It's like, I can't wait to hang up on them. But actually, it's become a really important part because it allows you to have sort of that one-on-one connection with buyers. So on the DTC side, that's something that's evolved for us.
So I heard a lot of good meaty topics in there. So let's talk about wholesale first, and we'll kind of work our way through the different channels and thinking about how do you go to market if you're selling your wine wholesale to a distributor out in the world, and how Alison mentioned distribution consolidation, and we talked about when we were discussing on our pre-call, talked a lot about how do you manage distributors, if that's the right the verb to use. How do you interact with distributors? How do you make sure that you're working on the same project plan for your brand? That's important for your brand. So first, thought we'd talk a little bit about how often are you visiting those distributors and what kind of conversations are you having with them and why that's important, and how that interacts with your brand when you're doing that market work. So I know all of us have traveled the U.S. and abroad to work with distributors. So maybe more of a story that came up with a distributor visit or a recent visit or one that you're planning market work, and how often you're interacting with that distributor.
I'll speak for myself. Have worked with mainly smaller wineries with maybe brands that aren't as established and therefore have a little less leverage. And I would say the perspective of developing distributor relations is one where you're willing to grow with the distributor. Instead of finding the hot kid on the block that has a list as long as your arm of Oregon wineries they represent and you want to be part of that cool gang, rather than that, take a step back and say who has one Oregon winery in their book or two, and who is showing a lot of grit and determination, and I'm willing to help support that, and we can grow together and then support that market. I would say once a year, twice if you can get there. But I found for smaller wineries that tends to be a better marker of success for us after a couple of years.
I think there's also a really delicate balance relative to how many brands are in the book. You don't want to be in the book necessarily that has the list as long as your arm, but you also might think about whether you want to be in a book that has no experience selling Oregon at all. Do you want to be that first person? Because then there's a lot of coaching and training that needs to happen. It can also turn into a great opportunity, but you have to kind of look at that and decide how much time you have to dedicate to that geography.
And so how often are you visiting markets, Annie?
It varies wildly. I'm headed for Seattle after we finish talking here. And Seattle, I tend to be in, anywhere from 2 to 4 times a year because it is basically a local market. But we're in 30 states across the nation, as I mentioned, 31, and there are some states that are doing just fine without a visit every year, which is kind of amazing to me. There are others that I really need to see at least once a year or twice a year. It just really depends.
And we had talked about maybe on the pre-call, that maybe choosing your markets rather than trying to be in New York City with all the other competition, and how you might choose specific markets to visit. Do you take that strategy, Alison? Do you look at some kind of smaller, minor markets?
I'm a huge fan of B and C markets because my approach is always let's go where they want us. And New York is, I think, a great example because that's a market that, they kind of, maybe they want us, but they don't really want us because they have everybody, every amazing wine producer from around the world wants to go to New York, and they have, off the wall incredible events all the time. But you go to Omaha, Nebraska, they will love you because they don't get as many supplier visits. So, if you're going to spend a day in the market, how much are you going to spend in New York versus Omaha? How many accounts are you going to see? How many placements are you going to get? And, if you're trying to deplete more wine, you can easily do that in Omaha versus New York. Now, New York has a lot of other reasons why you need to go there: PR, media, brand building, and so forth. So you have to weigh that in. But if you're looking at it from a kind of a dollars and cents perspective, a lot of the B and C markets can have a lot better payback.
I concur. I think that's absolutely on point. Even here in Oregon, in my tenure as a wholesale rep, we would have winemakers from all over the world come to visit, and they all had this very short list of restaurants they wanted to be on this list, let's say Pigeon here in Portland. But if we could get them to spend a day in Bend or spend a day in the Willamette Valley, it may be less prestigious in some aspects, but you're going to move a lot more wine. You're going to be the only winemaker or person from the winery they're going to see that week or even that month possibly, rather than staying in the Portland market and you're a dime a dozen at times.
I think also you touched on a great thing there with there are B and C markets within A markets. So going to the more far-flung portions of markets, if you're struggling with getting, let's say, Seattle proper in the books with your Seattle distributor, but they might be interested in seeing you in Edmond or points north, you can also maybe get more leverage with winemaker dinners and tastings in smaller markets within those larger states.
You can have a lot better day in Long Island and Westchester County than you can in Manhattan. You'll feel like it would be a lot more gratifying because you're actually going to sell wine.
And no subway dirt on you. Yeah. So what's a good story? I mean, was there any subway dirt stories? I mean, what's a good story when you're working these markets of something that that you remember, or that was really funny, or that taught you something? I mean, when I think about doing market work, some of the events that I've gone to that were more industry-sponsored events, it's been really interesting after the event to then spend time with your Oregon colleagues that you maybe don't always get to see, or you're seeing in different kinds of settings, and to be in Omaha or outside of Chicago at a fun venue afterwards has been good. You learn a lot from your brothers and sisters in arms of being out there, so trading stories. So I always look forward to that kind of bonding time of travel when you're running into different people. Sometimes you don't even know you're in the same state as some of your industry colleagues, so that's fun to meet up. But any good stories? We need some gossip or dirt or something.
I always remember like the bad things that happen.
Yeah,
that's all right.
I've got
give us one you learned from.
There was one really fun event that a lot of us are in Tom Elliott's book down in the Bay Area, and he tried out this event one year called the Movable Yeast, where we actually got into vans, and there were probably about 12 of us, and it felt like it wasn't going to be successful, but amazingly we did sell wine. We would just descend on retailers and have this power tasting of about 12 brands back to back. And it's this interesting little kind of guilt trip that you put them on. And if they're going to buy one, they're going to have to buy something from at least half of the people standing in front of them. So it was really interesting how it felt like almost a flash mob of wineries, but it was a successful process to go through, and I see Tom nodding his head out there. I think you were on that, weren't you, Tom? Yeah. So kind of fun, too. It was really a fun event.
And I would agree with that sentiment in that sometimes we see each other as competitors, but when you're on the road, if you can join together, I think with a couple other Oregon producers, you can get enough synergy and enough of a pull to get some of your restaurant and retail buyers to pause their day and come to a tasting more, come to an event. So rather than seeing that as more of a cannibalistic aspect, I would see it as it's much more advantageous to join forces if you can on the road, in my experience.
Yeah.
I agree. One thing that I always do when I'm out in the market is I start planning the return trip, start planning the next trip, so that when you're there, making mental or writing down, who are the best folks to be working with in the market and what accounts you want to visit next time you're back, start planning events for your next trip back. That makes it easier and more productive. So often your first market visit someplace may not be quite as productive because you don't know the lay of the land, you don't know who all the key people are, but then once you're there, you do all that research and you figure out how to make your next trip really impactful and more efficient as well.
It's a good point. And a question from the audience is asking, do you have a revenue target per day or a case target per day when you're working in the wholesale channel that gives you a satisfaction of an ROI? Is there number of cases that you're...
I would say absolutely. I mean, it fluctuates based on the market you're in, but what are the markers of success when you take an FOB trip? I think that's a really good point because you can fly out there, you wine and dine, you smile and you nod and you pour wine, you get home and you say, well, was that a successful trip? And I think if you're only looking for how much wine you move per appointment while you're there in the flesh, you're often going to be disappointed because a lot of buyers are not buying on the spot. But I would say you'd be really pressed to find a road warrior that's not looking for the PO order once they get home. Mm-hmm. But if you can, hopefully you've actually uploaded before the trip and you've gotten the right support and you've looked at depletions and you know what they have and what they need to have, because no one's going to sell those single vineyard designate wines like you are or the winemaker. So I would say a month before you get there, you need to look at that and say, hey, I'm coming in 3 weeks. Let's order up on these single vineyards. So that way, when you are there and you're razzle-dazzle, you have the inventory there to make the sale. And because if you're waiting till after the fact, I think you're going to lose a lot of that momentum.
It's a good example. Let's talk about the difference between when you're on those trips, when you're working in a retail channel and talking to a retail buyer. Alison mentioned Fred Meyer, or you're working with an on-premise restaurant. I mean, how is your approach different in those different channels?
So I think, and this is not just specific to distribution, but across all of our channels, I think you got to have the right product at the right price for the right channel. And whether that's, for DTC, having different wines for DTC versus distribution, and then on the distribution side, having products for retail versus on-premise. Because sometimes the products can go both ways. Oftentimes it's just a pricing difference, whether you have by the glass pricing or not, but understanding how to walk in and before you have that meeting, assess the shelf and see, where are their holes, where are their opportunities. You'll know their Oregon knowledge pretty quickly if you look at the Oregon section and there's 2 versus 20 wines. Same thing on a wine list. Look at it. Where are the opportunities? Do they have an Oregon Pinot Noir by the glass? That's something, in my mind, I'm a little biased, but I think every restaurant should have. And if they don't, then is that an opportunity? Do you have something that can play in that area? So be looking at where the holes are and how to assess where those opportunities are. And that's also something that you should be teaching the distributor sales reps as well, how to assess the shelf and the list to find the opportunities for your wines as well.
Go ahead.
I would say also, just to back up a tiny point, is I would say be upfront with your distributor when you're starting in a new state to learn the laws and regulations. I have been constantly surprised at going to a new state how I feel that none of them are the same as far as whether they're controlled or you can sell liquor there or however many liquor licenses are strongly controlled that the state gets to give out. Know that information beforehand. Are you allowed to wheel and deal? All of that will give you a lot more tools in your tool belt when you sit down with the buyer, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. I'd also say the flexibility, if you're going into a restaurant, I think you might be surprised how buyers are very forthcoming with data about their programs, asking, In your wine program, how much of your revenue comes from buy the glass as opposed to buy the bottle? Your buy the bottle list may be as thick as a phone book, but if it's only 10% of your sales, then I really need to make sure that I have the right product for you by the glass placement, and then finding out what the sweet spot is for that price point.
Yeah, I think the key is really knowing your audience, and you two have both touched on that. You'll come across some buyers who are just really reticent and really shut down, and because they're just jaded and they've met with far too many people, and you're just another one of those people. And until you can penetrate that a little bit with your scintillating personality, it's going to be tough. So sometimes when I run into that issue, I'll just kind of start asking simple questions like, is there a gap in your program? Is there something you're really looking for today? What can I help you with? Just to kind of get them jump started a little bit. And then I think going back to the retail side, I really find myself the minute I walk in that door looking around, do they have shelf talkers on the shelves, or do they abhor shelf talkers? They're both very black and white camps in that regard. Have some tools at your disposal on your website or in your bag. Have shelf talkers ready to go for them, so that you can either choose to pull them out or not, depending on their preference. So on the retail side, there's that. But make sure you ask, because people who hate shelf talkers hate them with a passion. And then on the other side, on the restaurant side, as I said, find out where their gaps are. And I think you've made a really good point. I think it was Alison, of looking at the glass pour and seeing what is on there already. And I am with you that there should always be an Oregon glass pour. I thought yesterday that some great points were made up in I can't remember what the seminar was called, was the evolution of the Oregon market, about that pyramid of having, if you were in the room, of having the by the glass level pricing. Those things don't necessarily have to be Pinot Noir, because maybe we can't make a by the glass offering that's really good quality enough and plentiful enough to offer smaller or lower prices on, but maybe it's your Pinot Gris, maybe it's your alternative varietal of some sort, and just having that at the ready in addition to your, of course you all want to sell your single vineyard designates, your super premium wines, but having that diversity in your lineup is great.
Those are all really good points. It sounds like what we're saying is to have respect for your buyer and do some homework ahead of time. Looking at the wine list either beforehand or as soon as you walk in while you're waiting for the buyer is really important. If you want a buyer, in my experience, if you want a buyer to respect what you're presenting and take the time to hear what you're having to say and see your wines, you should do the same amount of homework back. Knowing what accounts you're in and going to is important, and understanding what they need and maybe how you can help them. A couple of specific questions coming up. On the retail side, do most retailers, especially grocers, require UPC bar labels, scan codes? And so it's in major retailers, it's pretty predominant. Some smaller independents don't require it, but have any of you run into what you've decided to do then for your brand? Is it standard for your brand at this point?
We purposely decided not to do UPCs, but that's, again, being a smaller winery total, because of the chains that we were strongly dependent on here in Oregon didn't require them, and they did them themselves. So, but I'm sure if you reach a certain point, it just becomes much more feasible to buy the UPC.
We have UPCs on everything, and it's really funny if you accidentally make a mistake and the UPC changes from vintage to vintage. Don't do that.
It's not funny.
That's
not funny.
It's not. We can laugh in hindsight. So the UPCs, if you want to get into more regional chains and retail, you absolutely need to have. We've also been able to sometimes use them in DTC as well, just to minimize inventory, mess ups in the POS too, just to have it scan and then it's a little bit more accurate.
We're kind of in the middle between these two in terms of quantity produced, and years ago we looked at it and we thought, does this seem to make our wine a commodity? Is this something that says volume to have that UPC code on the back label? And we decided that there were so many opportunities that came up that outweighed that feeling, and we decided we didn't need to worry about that anymore. So
it depends on your brand and the size of your brand and where you want to sell. But again, doing your homework and making sure you're not showing up at that kind of account if you don't have UPCs and vice versa. I think it makes sense. And there's another question about doing your research on the territory ahead of time and understanding the demographics of, say, Omaha, Nebraska. What kind of resources are we using to do that homework on either the wine drinkers that live there or the number of accounts? Is there a way to find out how many accounts, what the account universe is? Is there software and all this new technology we have?
Yeah, so there's this thing called the internet, which is amazing. And so, yeah, it's great to know all that stuff Amy just referenced, but one thing that because I'm not a huge sports follower, but I always check in on who are all the local sports teams before I land in a city, because it totally makes a difference, because the buyers are jazzed if their team's up, or if they're not, you can kind of be like, oh yeah, my team XYZ is also having a bad season. And that stuff makes a big difference. So you're laughing, but it really does, if you can. Current
events in general, I think. If you're going to a place that just had a hurricane, you need to know about that and what they're facing. That's all they're talking about. They're concerned about it. It's a very valid point, whether it's sports teams or current events or what's happening in Omaha, Nebraska. We're picking on Omaha today. We're all going to go visit. We're all going to be in Omaha in about a week.
I would say demographics these days are really compelling to myself. The way that our nation is shifting its population growth as baby boomers retire through domestic and international migration, there's a lot of big shifts that have happened since 1990 to 2015. So many of our states have almost doubled in size. So knowing where states are kind of seeing a slowdown in that and where all the people are moving to, it's not going to give you the specific account information, but it can tell you if a state is underperforming. If Texas has been giving you the same numbers for 5 years, but it's a state that grew by, I believe, 63% in 25 years, that then that's maybe a conversation you need to have with your distributor. So I think some very base foundation demographics can kind of give you a general idea of some expectations.
I'll go the human relations route on this question. Just getting to know your distributor as a partner, which was also mentioned yesterday. Having the conversations with them about what's going on with them, with their market, with any weather issues or anything before you show up. And then also, Oregon is a very collaborative industry, and a lot of us who work distribution, if we happen to run into each other on the road or happen to be running buddies, end up talking a lot about these things together and collaborating and sharing information with each other. Yes, we compete against each other, but we also collaborate. So don't feel shy about talking to your colleagues in the industry too. It's one of the most wonderful things about our industry.
Absolutely, yes. When choosing a distributor, I would say first reach out to your colleagues and say, do they pay on time? And
exactly.
What do you think? And
question number one.
And then I would say also, the idea of an ideal ride-along day varies so much from distributor to distributor. To think that, it's standard practice that you get picked up at 9:30 and you hit 7 poignant accounts and then you have an evening event does not translate state to state. So I now, beforehand, say this is what I'm anticipating, what can we do to help set this up for success, rather than getting there and feeling really disappointed that I've flown this far and spent this time and we're seeing 3 accounts that day. So I would say do as much preventative or research beforehand in that aspect.
All great points. There's also a few pieces of data that you can buy. There's things like Adams Research that you can buy for about $1,000 subscription fee that gives you demographic data, gives you wine drinker percentage, and so you can compare if if it's a high index state like California, where I don't remember the exact number, but if 35% of the population are wine drinkers in California and you're indexing only 2% of your volume in California, you can see that there's room to grow there, but there's a lot of competition in California with wine, of course. So if you pick a different state, like maybe Kansas, and that index is 8% of the population are wine drinkers and you're indexing 2, you can see where that growth can be too. And those are pieces of information that you can then have good good discussions with your distributor. You can also buy account universe data. I mean, there's different subscription models with BDN, the Nielsen companies, same people that do TV ratings. You can get account universe data. All of this data is for sale. You can buy your depletion data based on your UPC scans. I mean, all those different things are out there. It just depends on the size of your brand and what kind of information you're interested in owning and being able to action against.
And even if you're not buying the depletion data, which is awesome, you can get it for free from your distributor. It just may be like a printed report that they fax you or email you. So it's not like in a Excel spreadsheet necessarily. Right. But that's really helpful to be familiar with what accounts you've gained, what accounts you've lost, what types of accounts you've gained or lost. Is it, on-premise versus off-premise? Is it chain or independent? And that way you're a lot more knowledgeable when you walk into the market and you can ask more questions. Hey, why did we gain these 3 accounts? Why did we lose these accounts? And I think it's also really important to, back to the travel question is, even if you can't visit a market every year, you should still be touching it. At Sokol Blosser, our goal is to touch it every month. So they get some kind of monthly update about what's happening, what we've noticed, whether they're on track or off track, and what upcoming promos and so forth that we have going on.
A couple specific questions about UPC. And happy to answer any of these afterwards as well if you think of things afterwards. But you tend to have one UPC for that wine for the life of that wine. You don't change it by vintage. I wouldn't recommend changing it for vintage. You want that historical data if that's a channel you're continuing to work in the chain retail environment. You want to keep that same UPC. It takes a lot for that retailer to set up a UPC. There's a lot of forms you have to fill out for Fred Meyer's these days. So once you fill that out, you want to keep that same wine in their system. That stays tied to that wine forever. And there's a couple different UPC codes that you can buy, series of codes for your brand, and GS1 is kind of a nationally recognized one. So someone is saying on a tip that they ran into it with Kroger where they only took GS1, but they had a different kind of UPC from a different system. So do your homework ahead of time to understand if you're going after a specific retailer, what they require ahead of time. There is a lot of setup with chain management in that channel, so it's not as easy as just placing the bottle on the shelf. There's a lot of setup that goes into that channel. One of the questions coming in when you're working, this is more on the distributor side of things, what do you find most effective to work with the distributor within those channels, whether it's a special price allowance or a depletion allowance or some sort of incentive and how that gets tracked? And so maybe a comment on how that works. And we haven't talked as much about on-premise, so maybe we pick on on-premise for a minute and talk about how you might incent an account. And somebody mentioned understanding the pricing laws because every state has its own way to do this. So you end up with multiple ways you're working with on-premise.
I've often let the distributor, I don't want to say lead that conversation, but I ask them what resonates with you, because what I don't want to do is go through the trouble and the time and the tracking to set up a program that's not going to resonate with their needs or what motivates their rep. So first off, to set it up for success, you have to say, does this sound appealing? Does this sound like it would work for your team? And then after that, I tend to take, for on-premise, we often have enjoyed doing Magnum programs because we often have lots of Magnums, so we have set that up as a possible incentive. A lot of people do the $5 on a case and whatnot. It just depends on how much I think your distributor is vested into tracking a lot of that, in my opinion. But I'm sure you all might have deeper experience than I do for that one.
One thing that comes to mind for me is DA programs, depletion allowances, can also tie in nicely to tracking accounts that have your wines by the glass. So it's a great way to get regular monthly reporting out of your distributors, and I know sometimes it can be a real pain to get them to give you depletion allowances. Some distributors just aren't ready to do that, unfortunately, and you have to keep on top of them. Most these days are, but depletion allowances give you that opportunity to know once a month where your wines are selling by the glass and how much they're selling for, and that gives you a chance to adjust your price for on-premise only in markets where it's legal, and there are some markets where it's illegal, so you have to be up to speed on all of that.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about, we have two other channels that were kind of on our list. A little bit about direct or direct to, Gaironn has a special name for this. What do you call it?
Just the wholesale market here in Oregon,
Yeah.
just self-distribution?
Self-direct.
there you
Thank you. I couldn't come up with it. Obviously, we don't do that. Didn't come to mind. But let's talk about those two channels and talk a little bit about, maybe Gaironn, you would start then and talk a little bit about when you're thinking about your brand and you're creating your strategy, what % of your business are you trying to sell through the three categories of FOB wholesale, self-direct distribution here in Oregon, and then direct? That's part of your business planning, and then
Yes, that's a great question. Gosh, I could talk all day on that one. So in my opinion, you want to be as balanced as possible. In a perfect world, we're selling maybe equally a third through all three of those channels, but that's because our tasting room was much more bare bones and not as experience driven. So to have an idea that we'd get more DTC would probably not fit our business model presently. I would say I really am a fan of Oregon wineries that are kind of needing to up their market savviness but are still really nimble. Trying out a little self-distribution. I'm not going to say it's easy. All of these paths take a lot of work, and I think most of us in here know that selling the wine is kind of the hardest part of this whole game. So, that being said, I think there's a lot to be learned to putting your wine in a bag and hitting the streets and letting the buyers give you that very honest feedback about not only how your wine tastes, but what your label is communicating to them, if your price point is set up for success. You'll hear a lot of things you may not like to hear, but I think it's invaluable. When I see new clients come on and they think, oh, I've made this great wine, now I'll offer it to a distributor. And just to see that, unfortunately, there's no leverage for that. You have to be an established brand, I think, to be set up to see a distributor run with your wine. So I think just putting the wine in the bag and getting out there and seeing what this world is like for your distributor will give you a lot of respect for what they do every day. But it will also teach you and help you make your brand as competitive as possible. I feel like 10 years ago, you could have some pretty silly labels and still get away with it. And these days, I think almost every avenue of this business, there's not much margin for error.
And on just another point on self-direct, I mean, describe that a little bit. So you're bypassing a distribution model where you're self-distributing, you're selling directly to the account, and then you're invoicing, delivering.
Well, there's a few ways to finagle that. There are delivery companies here that will do that part for you and do the invoicing as well. But you are cutting out the distributor. You are either yourself going out with the wine, or you have a sales rep that just does that for you. And obviously, then you absorb that margin. You're getting kind of this Goldilocks spot in the margin, as it's not the lean FOB, but it's not the fat direct to consumer. But then again, you're also having to pay someone to go out there and beat the streets. But you know that your wine is always open and always in the bag, and you're not having to twist anybody's arm to get your wine in that spot. So there's a lot to be said for that model here in Oregon. I think it's a really nice opportunity for smaller wineries to kind of
test distribution in a way, if that's not something you have done with your brand before.
Yes. So,
what's your strategy on how much percentage in each channel, Alison, and how important is direct to your business?
Direct is really important. It's a third of our business. And so we segment ours by direct, so DTC, and then U.S. distribution, and then export. So export for us is about 10%, 10 to 12%, and then the remainder is U.S. distribution. So we take a really very broad diversification approach because, we've been around for 45 years. We've seen a lot of ups and downs in every single part of our business. And so for us, having that very, very broad base of diversification and that very broad distribution has been very helpful. Like in the last recession, things were tough in the US, but Canada was still doing great. And then things kind of reversed. Canada wasn't doing so great, but the US was doing better. So, having that broad base of distribution has been really helpful.
Annie?
And we don't self-distribute at all, although we could. In Oregon and Washington, but because we're in so many states, we've elected to have distribution here and in Washington handled for us. We're probably about 70, 30, 60, 40 heavier on distribution than we are on direct. We'd like to be 50-50 or more. Sell more wine direct is Scotty's mantra. So because we're kind of catching up on having only had bricks and mortar as a tasting room since 2010, it's been a challenge to catch up with our colleagues on the consumer direct side. We have had a very successful wine club since 2001, so that's helped quite a bit. We are only in one international market, and we're looking further into international a little bit. But I think our emphasis will probably be on selling more wine direct and kind of streamlining the states we're in, because we are a 10,000 case production winery, and so being in as many states as we are may not make that much sense. So there are a few that I literally don't visit that may end up being left by the wayside.
And how often are you reviewing that strategy? Is that something annually when you're looking at what production you had from prior vintages? I mean, how often are you laying that out and altering your kind of percentage of channel?
We're looking at it annually for sure, but really quarterly and sometimes month to month. We're looking at the distribution numbers in particular month to month. So it just depends on what each geography looks like at any given time. Something to keep a really close eye on.
Yeah. At A to Z, we don't do self-direct at all, and we're really not, we're passively doing direct sales. I mean, if you know we have A to Z, or if you're online, you can buy, but really our model is 100% through distribution and very limited export, so it's a little bit different model than everyone else here. Our other brand, Rexil, definitely focused on direct, and about a third of our business is going through direct, whether it's wine club or tasting room. So kind of different experiences and different models. The A to Z strategy has been that way pretty much from the beginning and hasn't changed, but you're hearing that different brands, as they evolve, have different strategies. There's about 4 questions up here about, do distributors pay on time? And if they don't, what do you do? So any good financial tips for that channel?
I'd like to say we all need to make sure that we are riding them on on-time payments, and don't give in. Hold wine back. I know it's painful, but hold it back. Don't let them have the next shipment until they pay you, because the more you let them do that, the more they're going to do it to us all, and we really need to make sure that that doesn't happen. So I'm probably known as one of the biggest sticklers in this regard, and I'm probably feared and hated for it, but I'm kind of proud of that. It pays off in the long run, literally. But that withholding of wine, it hurts the end customer so much, but you got to do it.
Yeah. Amen. Thank you, Annie.
You can ask for prepayments. I mean, there's different things you can do to ensure that. And then when a colleague calls you for a reference, I mean, give the honest opinion rather than sugarcoating it because you're embarrassed. Also, my tip on accounts receivable to whoever's doing that in your organization, if it's you, know the person's dog's name. I mean, get to know them, do your homework ahead of time. If you can have a rapport when they're running that check run, I mean, we know how it works when we have limited funds and we're running a check run. The people you've talked to recently that are really nice to deal with, you kind of put at the top of the list.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
be on the top of the list, because sometimes we all know you have to make choices of how you make payments. So
I would agree with that, and that realize it's not probably your first point of contact at the distributor is the one that's cutting the check. It's not the sales manager. It's an accountant or it's the finance manager. So learning who that person is. And then if you haven't held wine back like we should have, and they have like 4 invoices, rather than, I'd say, I've had more success being like, let's work together to come up with a plan. I want to see a check every 2 weeks until we break down these 4 invoices, and rather than waiting for one invoice and then the other invoice, put it all as one lump sum, and then try to just work out a plan that they can commit to with a paper trail, has been my best marker of success. I've also tried the tear-jerking letter of like, here's a picture of me and my children, and we're a small winery.
That's legal.
And that did not work. I really thought that would work. So I find that just the plan works better.
I think you have to decide how much credit risk you're willing to take as well, and that's actually part of your channel strategy. So if you want to absolutely be guaranteed that you're going to be paid on time, then go work with Southern Wine and Spirits or RNDC, and you're going to be a very small fish in an enormous pond. So if you decide that what you really want to work with are those smaller distributors who you may be one of only a few Oregon brands, but they're going to love you and they're going to love taking your wine out, you have to know going into it that you're likely taking a much bigger credit risk than if you just went with a really big guy like Southern or Breakthrough or whatnot.
Yeah, kindness does really help. By the way, I know I'm the hard guy up here, but getting to know the people that are actually writing the checks and saying things like, "Can you please let me know when I can expect this check?" instead of, "Hey, you're overdue. You know, what's up?" Just being very kind and understanding too, because you don't know what these people are dealing with in their lives either.
Yeah, and I think if sometimes you let them know, like, hey, we're dependent on this payment to make our next bottling run, like, then they're like, oh, so A plus B equals C, okay. And then I think when sometimes that resonates more, that there's a particular thing that you'd really like to spend that money on, that's how.
And saying thank you, even for on-time payment. You know, we all know, we hear about the hardships in our colleagues' lives. If you hear some good stuff, that might help too. So saying thank you, even though they owe you the money, I understand, they got your wine, but it's important. Question about samples. Do you have different amounts of sample percentages or allocations in these different channels? Do you sample more on-premise? You know, are you trying to control that in direct? Is it worth over-sampling to get the sale? Question on sampling, is it different by channel? And about how much, is there a % of sales that you're kind of gauging that by, or every sample's a good sample?
I kind of fall into the sample away mindset, especially when it comes to single vineyard designates. I was actually, after last night's symposium, speaking with a sales manager here in Oregon who oversees the distribution. I said, what's the number one thing that a small winery can do to help you sell single vineyard designates? And he said 100% billbacks. Know that my reps can pull a bottle of that wine at any time, and it doesn't need to have 8 people he's going to pour it for that day. Maybe if there's just 1 or 2 applicable accounts, if they know that they can pull that and they won't get any pushback, that's huge for us. So for me, I would never want to think that a wine's not being sampled because of that. Like, if there's somebody in mind, for the love of God, please take the bottle. It's not going to sell if you don't. But that's just specific to that.
Yeah, people need to taste it in order to buy it, so samples are really important. They can also get out of control, so it's a really fine line. For us, we're targeting about 1.5% of sales as a sample budget.
We're targeting about 2% of sales as a sample budget. In new markets, I highly recommend letting it be 3 to 4% just to get launched.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So over sampling it when you're new to a market. And it varies from market to market. I thought that it would be really cool if we did 2% off the top of all of our distributors. And I had somebody come unglued about that. So they want to do the sample allowance and the billbacks. They don't want the off the top 2% necessarily. So don't think that what's good for one market might be good for another. Give them, ask them, give them an option. We could do this either way if you're comfortable with that. That's what we found.
That's good. So when you're thinking about direct versus retail versus on-premise, are you looking at your brand and kind of looking at the different wines that you have and thinking about that in your channel strategy? Are you taking higher end? We've talked about single vineyard designates. I mean, are you looking at the pricing and the different brands and then deciding which percentage of those wines should go to those channels? Is that part of your planning?
Ideally, yes. We can plan all that out and say you get this and that. I think that there's a certain amount of nimbleness that then comes with needing to react to that if it doesn't pan out. But absolutely, I mean, I think we've found that in entering new markets, rather than just saying, here's our whole portfolio, what do you want to work with? We say, you need to take at least 1 Chardonnay, at least 1 single vineyard designate Pinot, if you want to play with the glass pour gris and Pinot Noir. You have to, I think, set some parameters, because the Willamette Valley glass pours are a lot easier to sell. So that's going to be my experience where people naturally gravitate to. So I think it's really helpful to say, this is part of our program.
Are any of you using do you want to say something on that? You were coming in. No, okay. Are any of you using brokers in the world? So whether it's in the U.S. for a state-controlled state, there's a couple states out there that are kind of 4-tier that have brokers that they're selling to the state stores for you, Wyoming, PA kind of things. Or export is more common probably with a broker.
We've tried it all. So we've done the national broker, we've done the regional brokers, we did the national broker again. Actually, I think we've had 3 different national brokers just to make sure that that was not the right route for us. And now we actually really only have one broker, which is for Texas and Louisiana and Oklahoma. You have to have a broker, although we call them more distributors for like Pennsylvania and so forth, because they're also selling on premise. And there's advantages and disadvantages to a broker. It's another layer. It's a 4th tier. It's somebody else who's getting a share of the money, but it adds a layer between you and what's actually happening in the market. So if you do go into a broker relationship, make sure that they're the right kind of people to represent you. Be really clear on who's controlling the pricing, who's controlling setting the DAs, who's controlling the samples, and how their commission is paid. Are you going to net out all those DAs, from if they're earning a commission on sales and so forth? So just be really clear on that. And then also in export, each country's different. So if you have an importer, like in Canada, your importer for some of the provinces that are state controlled or provincial controlled acts more like a broker because they're getting a commission, but everything's going through the state, the monopoly.
And keep your questions coming. Good questions. So we still have a little bit of time, so keep them coming. Flipping back to on-premise for a minute, one of the questions I meant to ask when I was trying to get some gossip, I'm trying to get some good stories for you all to keep you awake before we're between them and lunch, so let's step it up a little bit here. Okay, so when you're going to on-premise, is it always work? Like if you're going out for a drink with a friend, are you working? I mean, what are you always showing your brand? Are you always talking about your brand? Is that comfortable, uncomfortable? Some of it's more natural for us. I mean, is it always work when you're at a restaurant?
It's the best kind of work, I think. Well, I kind of take the mindset that I rarely buy our wines off a list. I haven't found that to be the big resonating thing with buyers. So I don't, but I definitely am making contact with the buyer, dropping the card. So in that aspect, it's work, but it's quite lovely.
When
Better
are you
than
not
a real
working?
job?
I walk by my neighbor's recycling bin and I'm doing research, trying to figure out what they're drinking. So I don't know. You're always, whether you're being really outwardly about it or versus more quiet, you're always doing research, even if you're just on a social happy hour. You're looking at the list. Who do they have? Who do they not have? Who's buying the wine? And then you can follow up later with them.
Mm-hmm. Scotty and I sometimes have the debate when we're out for dinner in Oregon. Are we incognito or are we going to say who we are?
You're not, Annie. You are never incognito.
But no, sometimes it's fun to not say a word about the fact that you own a winery and just enjoy your meal and be a citizen for a while. But it is also equally nice to go to a restaurant that carries your wine, go there with friends and either drop a bottle for the staff just to be kind.
Good tip.
And to thank them for the fact that they carry your wines. And the servers, it's so funny to walk in with a bottle sometimes and set it on the table and I say, can I open that for you? No, you can open that for you and enjoy it with the rest of the staff. And they're like, oh, wow, that's really cool. Thank you so much. So that's a really nice touch, especially in the crowded Oregon market, to do that.
Absolutely. I think that people focus too much on who is the buyer and let's know that buyer, but it's really, that buyer can put your wine on the list, but if the servers don't know about it and don't believe in it, then it's really done nobody any good. I think investing in server appreciation, going in and server incentives, server bottles, having them out to the winery, if you can get servers to be your brand ambassador, they'll follow your brand through their whole career. Whether they change restaurants or not, they will be your biggest ambassador. So I think it's a big mistake to overlook that key component of our industry.
That's a great way to use those extra magnums that you have too as waitstaff incentives, and especially if you get something on by the glass, you can say, hey, we'll give you a magnum to see who, whoever sells the most by the glass or the most bottles over the course of a week, then they can get that magnum. And either taking them a whole bottle, or even if you buy a bottle and you have a glass or two, leave the rest and say, no, when you guys are, after shift, then enjoy it and try it.
Good tips. Also, if you're in a restaurant and someone orders your wine that you're not with, another table is either ordering that, especially if you can see the bottle. I'll buy the bottle, so I'll have the server put that bottle on our bill. again, you're working with the consumer, you're showing the staff member what you're willing to do from a brand perspective. So that's usually when I'm really willing to reveal who I am if somebody's drinking our wine already. I like that.
So follow this woman to every restaurant.
That's right. I'll buy your wine if it's A to Z or Rexall. Couple more questions about distribution. Lots of those popping up, and trying to understand what's the path to finding the right distributor. So we talked a little bit in the beginning about looking at their book, again, doing your homework and understanding where does your brand live within their book, and do you fit? Do they have lots of Oregon, only a little bit of Oregon? How much are you willing to teach them? Also, going to different tastings. I think you can meet different distributors if you're doing trade tastings in different states. So we might have a few other tips about how to find that right distributor, asking your colleagues we talked about. And then there's a couple questions that relate to what size do I need to be, or kind of what's a minimum supply of a wine that you could put through distribution. If you're only making a couple of barrels of one wine, do you want to do that through distribution, or does a distributor say that's not enough? And it probably depends on the brand and your wine.
I had a client that wanted to be sold in his particular home state. He only made 100 cases of wine, and I counseled him to not get licensed in that state, but instead to fly there, host winemaker dinners, and then offer direct sales for that, to take orders in and then ship it to the state that allowed that very easily. Because to try to get a distributor involved and get them to sample your wines and do all just for anything less than a pallet, I think is going to be waste everyone's time.
Yeah, you have to think about the cost of traveling to those geographies as well, and really doesn't make sense to travel to a geography if you're not going to sell 2-3 pallets a year to those geographies, depending on where they are. But yeah, depending on your size and your willingness to invest in not only the travel but the licensure, as you mentioned.
And it can be hard, even if you do have a distributor, getting them to bring in new SKUs as well, because distributors are not, they don't want to keep expanding their book, even though that's where their, new items are what's giving them a lot of growth, or giving them their growth. They still don't want to bring in new SKUs. So, helping them pre-sell, or if you have to take a SKU off the table to get a new SKU in, just keeping in mind, that you want every opportunity to make each of the products that they carry to be really successful.
And I think you want to make your story digestible to the sales reps. If you have 12, 14 different wines of yours in the book, and to expect those sales reps to be able to really differentiate between them and without having to look at the back label, I think is asking too much. I think it has to be, I think the magic number is like 8, but winemakers tend to always want a bigger number, so I think you have to find your sweet spot.
Use that for DTC. Having the 12 Pinots is great for DTC. You want that, but don't take 12 Pinots into distribution.
Right. There was a question you mentioned earlier about the different channels and the different wines for the different channels, and we kind of have 2 different wineries at Raptor Ridge. We have the wines we make for D2C, and we have the wines we make for distribution. And there's the creativity comes in on the side of the D2C, where you can have the different cuvées and the different single vineyards and the different varietals, but keeping it really simple for the distributor, I think, is the best case.
Exactly, and then having something that feels exclusive and very special for your DTC consumer, to have them incentivized to join your wine club and be on your mailing list, because they can't ever get that wine on a grocery store shelf.
Right.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, when you're out in market and showing wines, you don't want to be that person that has the 12 bottles that you're showing in front of somebody else.
Couple of questions about technology. Gaironn mentioned how much that's changed in 10 years. So there's questions about the technology we're using in the direct channel and point of sale, and if that's important and helps drive that percentage of your business in direct. And then also about CRMs, or customer management tools, if you have a sales force that's working for your brand, or how you're tracking those placements. Are you using any sort of technology to get smarter about markets? Or direct?
So the POS, the CRM, especially if you've got a wine club, is really important. I remember the days when we used to charge, enter every credit card in every month, or every 3 months for the wine club, and luckily that is gone. And making sure that the system that you're using is also PCI compliant as well. That's really important for wine club and charging. So we just switched. We were on a Be Loyal RMS, and now we're on Wine Direct. So the Fin 65 program. So that's been really helpful to be able to track purchases and analyze it and
work those phone
necessary.
sales.
And work the phone sales, to create those lists of who's going to get called. On the distribution side, I thought it would be brilliant to have a CRM to track every single person we touch, whether they have visited us in the tasting room or whether we've been out, making sales calls. And so we invested in Salesforce to try to track every time we've touched somebody, every email we send them. Like, it just seemed like the most brilliant idea, and the practicality of it is really tough. The sales team is out all day making sales calls. The last thing they want to do is go back to their hotel room and enter in business cards and, follow, we want them following up by email or text with the buyers, but not necessarily doing data entry. So that's been harder. The CRM side on distribution, we haven't quite figured out how to crack that, but we do we have all the depletion data, so we can at least track placements and our success rate with that.
Mm-hmm. I would say a nice little tidbit I notice is, as we're tracking demographics, we can, usually assess gender and, the groups and then tick marks of how many come into your tasting room. But I do think that knowing which generation and the demographics of age are very helpful, but you can't just ask, and you shouldn't rely on your tasting room staff to guess age. So when you have newsletter signups or wine club signups, I like to include birth date on there. You can send a happy birthday discount, something of that nature to touch that, but then you also have that data to track as well, because I think it's really important as our boomers are going to be aging out of that window to know where your target audience is, and are you getting the millennials you think you're getting and whatnot. So trying to capture that data is really important.
We're using Wine Direct, and on the consumer direct side, it becomes pretty important when Scotty and I are going out to markets to look at our customers for that specific state and send them an email and let them know about special events that are happening while we're visiting markets. So that's a great way to integrate your different pools of customers. And then a little MacGyver move for you, Alison. Wine Direct is a great way to build distribution mailing lists too, if you can find somebody on staff to enter those cards for you. Yeah, because it's pretty robust, and you can slice and dice your data and send to the right people. Yeah,
the dream is still alive.
All these tips. We're also with Fin 65 in our tasting room, which is more of a recent move, and I see Karen looking at me right now. One of the things she was most apt to think about was being mobile. So our old system had to be at a register at the tasting bar, and she wants to be mobile and be with customers, and they're sitting over there, or they're in the garden, and being on your phone or an iPad. So again, using that technology that is now available and being able to change and work with your customers in different ways, so it doesn't feel so much like a transaction, but you're sitting around a fireplace having a conversation and able to use that mobile device and still charge their credit card. That's pretty good. So we have a few minutes left, and I thought we'd just kind of take it back to kind of the 30,000 feet. I think when you're at a conference and you're getting all these different kinds of ideas, and then later you're trying to debrief yourself, kind of good to scale up a little bit, in my opinion, and think about what is my strategy, how should it change, what am I doing right for my brand, what did I learn over these last couple of days that helps me get better or more efficient, or think about new ideas. So I guess my ending question for each of you is, what is that strategic tip when you're doing your annual planning? It's kind of that time of the year when we're doing our annual planning, getting ready to go back out at it for 2018. What is a tip, even if you kind of mentioned something or alluded to it earlier today, what is a tip for this group as they're going to head back out into this brave wine industry and analyze their channel management strategy?
I would say, I don't know if this boils down to one tip, but it's important to see what do you enjoy and what resonates with you, and then try to build around that. That can sound a little corny, but I have a client right now who we're trying to look at ways to engage more and increase sales, and the winemaker is exhausted. And to say this winemaker is going to need to travel to another 4 markets that year, that's not going to really that's not going to behoove anyone. So it's more instead of saying, oh, you need to go work more, work harder, put more on your plate, it's a matter of saying, how can we actually enjoy what we're doing? And then that translates often to sales when people can feel that energy and see that you want to be there and you're not drained and it's not just another trip. So finding, I'd say, states that are underperforming and being able to bulk up those sales for that state that you already have established rather than just trying to add on new states and new paperwork and new visits.
Have fun. Good tip. Enjoy it. What do you think, Alison?
For me, it's, the right wine in the right channel, having extreme focus, and it's all about relationships.
Boy, you're not leaving me much.
You can repeat.
Ditto.
That's okay. Ditto.
All comes down to the relationships, too. I mean, I'm a firm believer in that, and I don't think we could have been as successful as we've been without really treasuring the relationships we've had over the years and keeping it simple. I think we can all try to be too much into too many things, and I agree. Choose what resonates with you and go with it.
Mm-hmm. Mine would probably be on the other side of the relationships with your staff, whether it's yourself, if you're a band of one, or if you're a band of many. The people that you're hiring as your colleagues and that you're training and that you're making sure understand and support your brand. I mean, those are the people out there smiling every day and doing the hard work, especially if it requires travel. So I think making sure that you're treating your colleagues the best you can, training them the best you can, and making sure you recognize their importance in the life of your brand and keeping the wine in their sights. So thanks for all the great questions. There's a few more that we didn't get to, and it sounds like they're going to record those, and we're happy to maybe talk a little bit one-on-one as you're kind of getting your stuff together. So we appreciate your attention. So thanks.